Hello, this is Andrew Perkins for Tuts Plus. Today we'll continue working with Symfony 2, where I'll show you how to get started working with databases. I'll be covering setup and config, generating the database, generating your getter-setter methods and table schema, and how to persist the data from a form into a database. So let's begin. Just going to switch into my text editor real quick. And the first thing we need to do is connect our app to our database and tell it what database to use. I'm going to be using MySQL. So to do that, under app, config, let's open up parameters.yaml. And in here, we can enter in our database credentials. So as I said, I'm just going to be using MySQL as my database. You can use whatever driver you'd like. I'm going to be leaving everything in here as is. The only thing that I need to change is the actual database name itself. I'm going to change this to tutsplus-symfony. Feel free to add in your own credentials or a different database driver or name if needed. So with our db config set, we now need to have Symfony, which uses Doctrine, to generate that database for us. Make sure to save your file. We can close it out. And let's switch into our terminal. Make sure that you're within your Tuts Plus Symfony application. And let's run the following command. php app/console doctrine : database : create. With our database created, now we need to add metadata to our person entity so that Doctrine knows how to map our class to our database. We do this with annotations, just like we did with our form validation inside of our person class under that entity folder. Let's go back into our text editor. We can close config, close app. Let's go into source, acme, demo bundle, entity, and open up person.php. And now at the top, underneath our constraint statement here, we also need to import Doctrine's ORM mapping using an ORM alias, like so. There we go. We can now access this mapping using the ORM alias. Now let's assign that metadata. This is essentially like we're creating a table using our person class and then creating fields in the table for each property in our class. This table can then be mapped to our class. So this person class is acting as our table schema. We want to tell Doctrine to map our person class to a person table. So right above our class declaration, let's open up a multi-line comment. And now we can use our ORM alias to tell this class that it is a Doctrine entity and it should be mapped to a person's table. Here's how that would look. There we go. Now that our class is mapped to a person's table, let's do the same thing for our properties, but have these mapped to fields within that table. Let's start with our email property here. So right after our validation annotations, let's put in another one here. Since this is just an email address and an email is just a string of characters, we can tell this to map it to a string column and then set its length to be 40 characters for a regular user email. There we go. Now let's do the same thing for our full name property. Again, this is just a string of characters, so we'll use a string column, and this time set its length to be 50. All right, so we have our mapping added to our email and full name properties. Now we also need to add another property to our person class, and that'll be an ID property so that we can uniquely identify each person. Right above our email property, let's add in a new one. This is going to be a protected ID property. Now Doctrine will use this ID as a primary key and auto-generate it for us once we add in our metadata. It looks just like the others where we set the column type, except this time I'll use an integer. And then we also need to make sure that it's an auto-generated ID using the following annotation. Alrighty, that's it for our metadata mapping. Be sure to check out Symfony's and Doctrine's documentation for more info on other options. Now we can save this file and close it out. Now, before we start persisting people to the database, we need to make sure that we have getter and setter methods for our ID property that we just created. We've seen how to create these manually a few lessons back when we did this for our email and full name props. Now let's see how to use the console to generate them for us. I'm just going to switch back into my terminal. And let's run the following command. php app/console doctrine : generate : entities space acme / demo bundle / entity / person. And this creates a backup of our original entity class and creates a new one with our getters and setters. So you can see it backed it up to person.php and then this little tilde. And then we have a new one called person.php as well, which contains our new getter and setters. So if we go back into our text editor and we look in that entity folder, you can see we now have our backup and our new person entity. If we open that up, scroll to the bottom, you'll see that we have our new method here of getID, which just returns the current person's ID. Now you'll notice that there was no setter created in here for the ID field, and that's because Doctrine is going to handle setting that for you since this is a unique key and auto-generated. Had we had other properties that needed getter-setter methods, like a gender property, the setter would have been generated as well then. All right, so our person entity is now complete. We just need to have Doctrine generate our table based off of this entity and its mapping. We can close out the person class for good, and let's switch back into our terminal, and we'll run the following command: php app/console doctrine : schema : update space -- force. And great, our database schema was updated and it ran our one query to create the table with our specified fields. Let's now modify our application to actually save a person into the database when our person form is submitted. Currently, it doesn't do anything with the person data. Let's go back into our text editor and let's open up our main controller. So under controller, open up main controller.php, and let's start in our index action. And down here in our if statement, where we're checking if the form is valid, right above our return statement, if it is valid, this is where we can save the person into the database. First, we need to retrieve the submitted data from the form as individual values and store them into variables. We'll start with the email field. There we go. Here you can see I used our form object. I called its get method to retrieve the email field, and then I called the get data method to retrieve its value. This value is then stored into our email variable. Let's now do the same thing for our full name field as well. I'm just going to duplicate this line, and I'll change this to full name, and we'll get the full name field. There we go. We now have our form submission data. Let's use our existing person object from above, the one up here, by passing in the submitted data to our setter methods. So right after our form data, let's use our person object. We'll call its set email method and just pass in our email. Then we'll do the same thing for the full name. We'll call set full name, and we'll pass in the full name variable. All right, we now have a new person object with an email and full name. We just need to persist this person into our database using Doctrine's entity manager. This will just manage the entire persisting process for us, making it really easy. We first need an entity manager object to work with. It'll look like this. And here's our entity manager. We can now call this emObjects persist method, passing in our new person, and this tells the manager that it should now manage this new person object. Here's how that would look. Now to actually save the person into the database, we need to call the emObjects flush method to run the query. And that's it. Perfect. Our person is now persisted to the database. All we need to do is modify the output response to show the data. So down here in our return statement, I'm just going to change this to show the person's name and email address. Perfect. Our form should now display, validate data, persist that data to a database, and then display the data back to the user. Let's try it out in the browser. Make sure to save your file and make sure that your server is up and running. Here I am in Firefox. We can visit localhost port 8000/index to view our form. Let's enter in an email and full name. I'll just use fake@gmail.com, and fake name is my full name, and we'll hit submit. Excellent. We get our response back with our form data. It says person fake name /fake@gmail.com was created. If we check in our database, here I'm just using phpMyAdmin. You can see that we have our Tuts Plus Symfony database that was created, and then it also generated our person table for us. And if we look inside, you can see our fake user or person that was persisted to the database. So that's it. Hopefully you found this helpful in learning how to work with databases in Symfony 2. Stay tuned for the next video in this series, and thanks for watching.